You know what I never really thought about until a few years ago? How they got a 2-ton cannon from the dock of a shipyard up onto the gun deck of a warship using nothing but rope and wood. I'm not talking about cranes. I'm not talking about steel cables. I'm talking about a wooden block small enough to hold in both hands that could lift 5 tons without breaking a sweat. I got a chance to watch a traditional rigger rebuild one of these blocks from scratch at a maritime restoration shop, and what I saw completely changed how I think about wood selection, grain orientation, and what timber can actually do when you understand its properties. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how the old naval blockmakers built these things step by step, and why every detail mattered when lives were on the line. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'll show you a simple trick for identifying one of the rarest and most remarkable woods on Earth using nothing but a bucket of water. Let's get into it. The wooden pulley block is one of the most underappreciated feats of engineering in the history of woodworking. These small devices were the backbone of every sailing warship and merchant vessel for centuries, and what makes them worth studying isn't just the history, it's the craftsmanship. Every decision the blockmakers made, from the species of wood to the direction of the grain, was driven by real mechanical logic. Once you understand that logic, you start seeing wood differently. So, let me take you back to where this tradition reached its peak and show you why it still matters. During the Age of Sail, a single warship in the British Royal Navy carried anywhere from 500 to 1,400 individual pulley blocks. Every sail, every yard, every anchor, every cannon relied on blocks and tackle to move. The HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, carried over 900 blocks just for her rigging, and the Royal Navy at its peak had over 600 ships in service. That meant the Admiralty needed more than 100,000 blocks per year. By the early 1800s, the demand was so enormous that the Navy built the Portsmouth Block Mills, one of the first factories in the world to use machine-powered mass production. But here's what's important for us. The machines at Portsmouth were designed to replicate what the hand blockmakers had already perfected. The engineering didn't come from the machines. It came from centuries of craftsmen figuring out exactly which woods to use, how to orient the grain, how to shape the sheaves, and how to bind the whole assembly so it could handle forces that would tear apart most modern hardware store pulleys. These weren't decorative objects. A single block failure could drop a cannon on a crew, collapse a mast, or lose a sail in a gale. The blockmaker's knowledge was earned through consequences, and that's what makes it worth studying. The first thing I learned watching a traditional blockmaker work is that the outer shell of the block, the housing that holds everything together, is not just a box. It's a carefully oriented piece of wood chosen for one specific property, resistance to splitting. The old Navy blockmakers preferred English elm for their shells. Here in the States, American elm works the same way, and the reason is the interlocking grain pattern. Elm has a twisted, interwoven grain structure that makes it almost impossible to split cleanly. You can try to drive a wedge through a piece of elm, and it will just laugh at you. That's exactly what you want in a block shell, because the forces running through this thing are trying to tear it apart in every direction. Now here's the detail that really got my attention. The grain in the shell has to run parallel to the axis of the pinhole. Think about that. The rope pulls down on the block, and the load transfers through the shell to the pin that the sheave spins on. If the grain runs perpendicular to that pin, you're asking the wood to resist splitting across its weakest plane. But if the grain runs parallel, the load compresses along the grain, and elm can handle enormous compressive forces in that orientation. I measured one of the restored blocks at the shop, and the shell was only about 6 inches long, 4 inches wide, and maybe 3 inches thick. A piece of wood that small, handling thousands of pounds because the grain was oriented correctly. That's not luck, that's engineering. Now here's where the real magic happens, and I don't use that word lightly. The internal wheel that the rope rides over is called a sheave, and the old blockmakers made their sheaves out of lignum vitae. If you've never worked with lignum vitae, you are in for a surprise. This is the densest commercially traded wood on Earth. It weighs roughly 80 pounds per cubic foot. For comparison, white oak comes in around 47. Hard maple is about 44. Lignum vitae is nearly twice as heavy as the hardest domestic woods most of us have ever touched. But density is only half the story. Lignum vitae contains a natural waxy resin. About a quarter of its weight is resin that makes it self-lubricating. When a rope runs over a lignum vitae sheave, the friction and heat draw that resin to the surface, and the sheave essentially greases itself. The old blockmakers knew this. They didn't need bearings. They didn't need oil. They had a wood that got slicker the harder it worked. Shaping the sheave was done on a lathe, and even experienced turners will tell you lignum vitae is unlike anything else. The grain runs in wild, interlocking patterns, and the wood is so dense that your tools need to be razor sharp. I watched the rigger turn a sheave about 3.5 inches in diameter and maybe 1 inch thick. He used a heavy gouge and took light passes, keeping the speed moderate to avoid overheating his edge. The finished sheave had a slight concave groove around its circumference, maybe 1/8 of an inch deep, just enough to keep the rope centered. And the surface off the tool was so smooth, it looked polished. That's the resin. It burnishes as you cut. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Once you have the shell blank and the sheave turned, the next step is mortising out the interior of the shell to accept the sheave. This is where precision really matters. The sheave needs to spin freely inside the shell, but with minimal side-to-side play. Too much clearance and the rope wanders off the groove. Too little and the sheave binds under load. The traditional blockmakers cut the mortise by hand, using chisels and gouges to hollow out a pocket just slightly wider than the sheave. I watched the rigger work to a tolerance of maybe 1/16 of an inch on each side. That's not much room for error in a piece of elm. The pinhole is bored straight through both cheeks of the shell and through the center of the sheave. The pin itself was typically iron on naval blocks, a simple rod that acted as the axle. But on some lighter-duty blocks, they used a lignum vitae pin, which meant the entire assembly was wood on wood, self-lubricating, and completely resistant to saltwater corrosion. That last point mattered enormously at sea. Iron pins could rust and seize. A lignum vitae pin on a lignum vitae sheave would spin freely for years in the worst conditions imaginable. The fit of the pin in the shell was snug, but not forced. You wanted it tight enough that it wouldn't walk out under vibration, but removable for maintenance. Some blockmakers added a small wooden wedge or a light iron cotter to keep the pin in place. Now the block shell on its own is strong, but it's not strong enough to handle 5 tons of load. That's where stropping comes in, and this was the detail that surprised me most. The traditional method was to wrap the entire block in a continuous loop of heavy rope called a strop. The strop passed through a groove cut around the outside of the shell, top and bottom, and then formed a loop at the top, where the block attached to the rigging or the load. What the strop does is distribute the force across the entire shell, rather than concentrating it at the pinholes. Think of it like this. Without the strop, all the tension runs through 2 small points, where the pin meets the shell cheeks. With the strop, the force wraps around the body of the block and squeezes it together, almost like a compression band. The elm resists splitting, and the strop holds it all in a tight embrace. Later blocks, especially after the Portsmouth Mills era, used iron straps instead of rope straps. But the principle was the same. Spread the load, protect the shell, keep the assembly together even if a cheek starts to crack. I found it remarkable that a piece of rope around a piece of wood could be the difference between a functioning 5-ton hoist and a catastrophic failure. Everything I've described so far is one single block with one sheave. But the real lifting power comes from how you combine multiple blocks into a tackle system. A single block changes the direction of force. You pull down, the load goes up. That's useful, but it doesn't multiply your strength. When you pair 2 blocks together, one fixed and one attached to the load, and run the rope back and forth between the sheaves, each pass of the rope shares the load. A 2-sheave system gives you a mechanical advantage of roughly 2 to 1. A 3-sheave system gives you roughly 4 to 1, accounting for friction. The old riggers could configure a set of blocks to give a crew of 6 men the ability to lift a 2-ton cannon smoothly and safely up to the gun deck. That's not theory. That happened every time a warship was fitted out, and the whole system depended on those sheaves spinning freely, the rope running true in the groove, and the shells holding together under enormous, sustained force. Every detail in the construction, the elm shell, the lignum vitae sheave, the grain orientation, the strop, all of it was in service of making that mechanical advantage actually work in practice. One weak link, and the whole system failed. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to assume myself that the old block makers would have shaken their heads at. The first pattern is ignoring grain orientation. Most of us pick a board based on appearance or convenience and don't think too hard about which direction the grain runs relative to the forces on the joint. The block makers couldn't afford that luxury. They oriented every piece based on load direction first and appearance never. If you start thinking about grain orientation the way they did, even in simple projects like a shelf bracket or a workbench leg, your joinery will last longer. The second pattern is underestimating wood selection. We tend to reach for what's available, usually oak, maple, or poplar, without asking whether the specific properties of the species match the demands of the project. The block makers used elm for the shell because of its interlocking grain and lignum vitae for the sheaves because of its density and self-lubricating resin. They matched the wood to the job with precision. We can do the same thing if we slow down and think about what each part of a project actually needs to do. The third pattern is relying on hardware instead of understanding the forces. Modern pulleys are cheap and easy to buy, but most people who use them couldn't tell you how the forces distribute through the system. The block makers understood exactly where every pound of tension was going and built accordingly. Even if you never build a pulley block, understanding how forces move through an assembly will make you a better woodworker. The fourth pattern is overlooking the power of external reinforcement. Most of us glue a joint, maybe add a screw, and call it done. The idea of wrapping a finished assembly in a continuous binding to distribute load is something we almost never consider. But the strop on a pulley block is essentially doing what a good wrapping of cord or a well-fitted metal band could do on a high-stress joint in your shop. It's an old idea worth revisiting. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. If you ever come across a piece of wood at a yard sale, an estate sale, or an old toolbox, and you suspect it might be lignum vitae but you're not sure, here's the simplest test in the world. Fill a bucket with water and drop the piece in. If it sinks, and I mean sinks like a rock, not floats low but actually goes to the bottom, there's a very good chance you're holding lignum vitae. It's one of the only commercially available woods on Earth that is denser than water. The specific gravity runs between 1.1 and 1.4, meaning it's 10 to 40% heavier than an equal volume of water. Most hardwoods, even the heavy ones like hickory or white oak, will float. Lignum vitae will not. Now, there are a few other tropical species that also sink, like IPE, and some varieties of ironwood. But lignum vitae has a distinctive greenish-brown color with a waxy feel to the surface that's hard to mistake once you've handled it. The end grain looks tight and swirly, almost like it's been compressed. If it sinks, feels waxy, and has that dark olive color, you've probably found something special. I've picked up 2 pieces this way over the years, one at a flea market and one from a bin of scrap at a boat repair yard. Both times, the seller had no idea what they had. Before you head out, I want to make sure you know about my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It goes way deeper than any single video can, with 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, and 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. If you want to bring these old shipwright methods into your own shop, this is the guide to do it. Just scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for spending time with me today, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one.